I'm Anthony Elstob, and this is my video on contemporary and cultural influences on design. I'm a user experience designer, and my role predominantly is about working with people, whether that is understanding people's needs and expectations through research, or working internally within multidisciplinary teams. Through my learning, I've identified concepts that are part of my role but hadn't fully explored them before. Therefore, this video, from a UX perspective, looks to discuss culture and identity, cultural awareness, cross-cultural communication, socio-cultural drivers, semiotics, and cross-cultural teams. First, let's look at culture and identity. Anthropologist Edward T. Hall's cultural iceberg model explains that there is an internal and external view of a person's culture. The idea that things above the surface are observable and things below are not. The external, or the visible, is the conscious part where culture can be observed, such as behaviours. The invisible, that lies beneath the surface, is said to be home to the individual's beliefs, values, emotions, and thoughts. In Hall's book, Beyond Culture, he writes that the invisible cannot be explored unless the person becomes fully submerged into that culture. This is reflective of user research. Contextual studies such as shadowing and moderated usability testing can provide the researcher significantly more insight of both behaviours and attitudes of participants, as opposed to unmoderated or remote. This immersion can also be used to inform and create personas, which are snapshots of a person's goals, attitudes, and barriers. Similarly, in the context of identity, in the book Understanding Identity in Organisations, the authors discuss how personality is built up of attitudes, temperaments, and stereotypes, the latter being of particular interest. An article exploring biases and perception states, "The implicit stereotypical associations picked up by an individual do not reflect a cognitive bias, but the associations prevalent within their culture." This discussion is interesting, as it's signifying that cultural biases, like stereotyping, are not part of the conscious mind, which relates back to the iceberg model in that biases happen beneath the surface in our unconscious mind. This is something a UX designer should be wary of when conducting research to ensure not to make assumptions informed by their own cultural biases. If we then consider some of the principles of cross-cultural communication, such as essentialism, which broadly speaking is a view that all things have set attributes to identify them, applied to culture, Adrian Holiday discusses this more in his chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Language and Intercultural Communication, specifically on neo-racism. Neo-racism is described to be cultural racism. He goes on to state that fundamentally it causes a person to start thinking in an us versus them mentality, or as he describes, the other. Another point he makes is about small cultures, which can take the form of neighbourhoods, work communities, friendship or leisure groups. He concludes that these groups form their own microcultures, which again lends itself to Edward T. Hall's belief that a person must submerge himself into a culture, no matter how big, to fully understand it. Continuing the discussion of research, I'd like to touch on mental models. The theory of planned behaviour has a number of key variables, one around perceived behavioural control and intentions. The theory discusses how a person might intend to do something, but factors like influence from other people, self-efficacy, and pressures of social normative might hinder that person's actuality. When conducting research, it's important to have awareness that participants might sometimes find it difficult to switch mindsets, to think what they would actually do versus what they should do. This can happen often in research, where participants might say that they think X, but in fact think Y, or something perhaps completely different, which means careful consideration and active listening is really important. I'd now like to change the topic to design, specifically global and local design. The key differences being, global design needs to appeal to a broad audience from multiple cultures and countries and reflect global trends and influences, whereas local design is autonomous. A specific market within a limited geographical location reflects local trends but may still need to incorporate a number of cultures. There is also a rising hybrid trend of global design, which is particularly popular within marketing. The reason these design considerations are important is because in digital, user interfaces can often transcend the globe. For example, Apple's App Store. Content and visual design become vital here for their pensive consideration of language, imagery, symbols, and even colour, whilst also careful use of semiotics if something is particularly visual, such as appropriate use of iconic, indexical, or symbolic uses of imagery. Designers need to also be aware of global trends to ensure interfaces and content are meeting user expectations in evolving or divergent trend areas. My final thought is about the consideration needed for working in multicultural teams. In digital, it's common to work remotely with colleagues overseas. This is enhanced, particularly because of the 2020 pandemic. Design and research relies heavily on social interaction, which can include both verbal and non-verbal communication. Using tools like a design vocabulary and storytelling can help negotiate common understanding. We should also respect fundamental principles such as that society is complex and culturally varied, appreciate that when communicating with others we can and should adapt our identity as a reflection of that discussion, and to avoid making generalizations or assumptions on things we don't know about an individual or a group. Upon reflection, understanding the cultural beliefs, behaviours and attitudes in certain settings could result in a significant difference in how a UX designer might approach a conclusion. It's important to have awareness, be respectful, and to reflect on our own conscious thoughts when considering design and research.